The man tacked the notice to her gate before he even said good morning. $47,382, Grady Draymond said, tapping the paper like it was a menu item. Due in 12 days. September 15th. After that, Calhoun Creek Ranch belongs to my father's bank, and my father's bank has already agreed to sell the water rights to me. Joey Calhoun didn't look at the notice. She looked at his hands, the way his right one kept drifting toward his belt, the way his knuckles were pale from being clenched too long before he ever got out of his truck. People who mean to hurt you telegraph it in their hands, not their faces. Faces lie. Hands don't. That loan was my grandfather's, she said. Paid current through October. Was. Grady smiled the way rich men smile when they've already won something and are only waiting for you to notice. Bank recalculated. Balloon payment clause. It's all right there in the fine print your grandfather signed in 2003. He nodded at the paper stapled crookedly to the cedar post. 12 days, Miss Calhoun. I'd start packing. She stood very still, feet a shoulder's width apart, weight settled low, the way she always stood without thinking about it, the way that made the ranch hands mutter that Joey Calhoun never seemed to need her balance checked. Grady didn't notice. Most people didn't. It only ever caught the attention of someone who'd learned to look for it themselves. Get off my land, she said quietly. He laughed, climbed back into his truck, and left a rooster tail of dust hanging over the cattle guard. Joey pulled the notice down, folded it once, and put it in her shirt pocket. 340 acres. Her grandfather's homestead. The only barn in the county that still smelled like her mother's saddle soap. 6 horses that trusted no one else to touch their feet. And 12 days to find $47,382 or lose all of it to a man who'd never worked a single day of dirt into his hands. She had been in worse rooms than this one. She just hadn't expected to be back in one so soon. Deputy Tom Reyes found her 20 minutes later at the county clerk's office, arguing quietly with the teller about a loan file that had somehow been misfiled 3 separate times. He'd known Joey for 2 years, long enough to buy hay from her, long enough to trust her horses with his daughter for lessons, not long enough to know why she flinched, just slightly, whenever someone came up behind her without announcing themselves first. "Draymond's boy give you trouble?" he asked. He served papers himself. Didn't send a process server. She kept her voice level. "That's not how a bank recall usually goes, is it, Tom?" Reyes rubbed the back of his neck. "No. Usually it's a letter and a phone call, not the chairman's son standing in your driveway." He glanced at her hands, resting loose at her sides, and then, almost without meaning to, at her boots, planted the way a boxer plants them, though he couldn't have said why he noticed. "You want me to look into it?" "I want the original note," Joey said. "The one my grandfather signed. Not a photocopy of a photocopy. The original, with his actual signature, from 2003. Bank says they'll have to search archives. Bank has 12 days to find a document that either exists or doesn't." She folded her arms. "I've waited on worse people than a records clerk." Reyes almost asked what that meant. Almost. He'd learned, in 2 years of buying hay from Joey Calhoun, that there were questions she answered and questions that made the air around her go very quiet, and a man with any sense learned to tell the difference before he opened his mouth. The ranch, when she got back to it that evening, still smelled the way it always had: cut alfalfa, wet leather, the particular sweetness of a barn that had never once been allowed to go to ruin. Her grandfather had built the west fence line with his own hands in 1961. Her mother had died in the front room in 2015, in a hospital bed dragged in special so she could watch the horses out the window. Joey had scattered what was left of both of them along the ridge above the creek, because neither one of them had ever wanted to leave this ground, and she didn't intend to be the one who let it be taken. 6 horses came to the fence when she walked the paddock. 5 were hers to train and sell. The 6th, a sway-backed bay gelding named Copper, belonged to nobody. He was there because 3 years ago she'd started letting the county's at-risk kids come out on Saturdays to groom him, and somewhere in that first summer she had discovered that teaching a scared 15-year-old how to earn a half-ton animal's trust did something for her own nerves that 6 years of therapy mandated by the Army had never quite managed. If Draymond took the ranch, he took that too. She wasn't the first. Earl Whitlock's spread bordered hers to the north. 400 acres his family had run cattle on since before Wyoming was a state, and by August his was already gone, signed over to Draymond Resorts for a fraction of what the water rights alone were worth, because a surveying error had reclassified half his grazing land as floodplain the same month his equipment loan came due. Earl was 71. He'd told anyone who'd listened that the surveyors never once set foot on his property, and nobody who mattered had listened, because Cy Draymond sat on the same county commission that would have had to investigate him. Joey found Earl at the feed store 2 days later, buying grain he no longer had land enough to justify. "They'll come for you next the same way," Earl said, not looking up from the bags he was loading. "Cy, don't lose. Man's been buying up water rights along this creek for 6 years, quiet like, one ranch at a time, and calling it a golf resort when really it's the whole valley he wants. You fight him, you fight the bank, the commission, and the paper. His cousin runs the paper." "I don't plan to fight anybody," Joey said. "I plan to find a document." Earl finally looked at her, and something in his face softened, the way old men's faces sometimes do around people who remind them of somebody they lost. "You've got a way of standing that makes me think you've stood in worse spots than a feed store, Ms. Calhoun. I mean that as a compliment. County could use somebody who doesn't run when Cy Draymond points a finger." She didn't answer that either. But she carried it with her out to the truck, the way you carry a stone in your boot, not painful yet, just present, a small pressure that reminded you it was there. Grady found new ways to be present too. On Thursday, a semi hauling gravel for the Draymond Resort's groundbreaking blocked her cattle chute for 4 hours during the 1 week she needed it clear for a buyer's inspection. On Friday, someone cut the fence along the northern pasture and 40 head of her cattle wandered into the county road before Danny, her 17-year-old ranch hand, spent half the night rounding them back in the dark. On Saturday, the water in the South Trough ran brown for 2 days before a county inspector, sent, coincidentally, by the same office Cy Draymond chaired, declared it naturally occurring sediment and left without testing it. None of it could be proven. All of it added up. And every incident bought Draymond Resorts a few more days of Joey Calhoun distracted, exhausted, and running out of the one resource that mattered most, time before September 15th. Danny Ruiz was the reason everything finally broke into the open. He was 17, quiet in the particular way of a kid who'd learned early that quiet kept a household calmer, and he'd been coming out to Calhoun Creek since he was 14, first through the Saturday program with Copper, then as an actual hire once Joey saw how careful he was with green horses. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father wasn't in the picture. Joey paid him more than she could afford and pretended it was standard ranch wage so he wouldn't feel like charity. Grady found him alone at the equipment shed on the Tuesday before the deadline, when Joey had driven into town to push the bank, again, for the original loan document. "You work for the woman who's about to lose this place," Grady said, leaning in the doorway, blocking the only easy exit. "Might want to start looking for new work. Draymond Resorts is going to need groundskeepers. Pays better than whatever she's paying you under the table." "I like it here," Danny said, and made the mistake of trying to step past him. Grady put a hand flat on his chest and shoved him back into a stack of feed sacks hard enough that Danny's head clipped the shelf edge on the way down. It wasn't a beating. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of casual, deniable cruelty a man uses when he already believes the world owes him deference and has simply decided to collect a little of it early. Joey came back from town 12 minutes later to find Danny sitting against the shed wall pressing a shop rag to a split above his eyebrow, and Grady's truck still parked in her drive like he had every right to be there. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She walked, the same unhurried walk she used crossing a paddock toward a spooked horse, weight low, hands loose and visible, nothing about her posture suggesting threat until she was 3 feet from Grady Draymond and it was already too late for him to reposition. "You put your hands on my employee," she said. "He got in my way." Grady straightened up, 6 inches taller than her and confident in every inch of it. "You want to file a report, Miss Calhoun? Go ahead. See how fast Sheriff Reyes's little department finds time for it, with everything else on his plate this week." She didn't file a report. She did something Grady wasn't prepared for at all. She reached out, closed her hand around his wrist as he lifted it to point at her, and turned it, not hard, not far, just enough that his shoulder locked and his knees buckled a half-inch and the color went out of his face in a way that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with sudden, animal understanding that this woman could have broken something in him and chose, very deliberately, not to. She let go before Danny had even finished sitting up. "Leave," she said. "Don't come back onto this property without the sheriff standing next to you." Grady left. But not before Danny, wiping blood out of his eyebrow, looked up at Joey with an expression that had far less to do with gratitude than it did with a question he didn't quite know how to ask. "Who taught you to do that?" Word moved through a small county faster than water through a broken trough. By Wednesday, the story wasn't Danny getting shoved into a feed shelf, it was Joey Calhoun dropping the Draymond heir to his knees with 2 fingers, and every version of it that reached her ears had grown a little, the way stories do, until she was half tempted to laugh at the parts that made her sound like something out of a movie. Cy Draymond didn't laugh. Cy Draymond called the bank. The recall notice she'd been fighting for 12 days turned, overnight, into an acceleration clause and a demand for immediate payment of the full outstanding note, not the September 15th balloon, all of it, effective in 72 hours, with a formal notation in the file that Ms. Calhoun had engaged in threatening behavior toward bank-affiliated personnel. Joey read the letter twice at her kitchen table, and understood, with the particular calm of someone who has learned exactly how much worse things could get, that Cy Draymond had just made the fight impossible to avoid a third way. She could lose the ranch to a technicality. She could lose it to a manufactured accusation. Or she could find the one thing that would stop both, the original signed note, the one Draymond's bank had somehow been unable to locate for 12 straight days. It was a young paralegal named Priya Anand who found it, working late at the title company where Joey's grandfather's original mortgage had first been filed in 2003, because Priya had grown up 3 ranches over from the Whitlock place and had spent her whole childhood hearing her father talk about what happened to Earl. She called Joey at 11 at night. "The balloon clause isn't on the original," Priya said, her voice tight with the particular adrenaline of someone about to do something that could cost her a job. "I found the 2003 filing in the county archive. There's no balloon payment language anywhere in it. What Draymond's bank sent you is a different document, same loan number, same date, completely different terms. Somebody drafted a second note years later and refiled it like it was the original. Can you prove that?" "I can prove the archive copy predates the version they sent you. I can prove the signatures don't match stroke for stroke, your grandfather's J and Joseph is different in both. I'm not a forensic examiner, Ms. Calhoun, but I know what I'm looking at, and so will a judge." Joey sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment, looking at the ridge above the creek where her mother and grandfather were buried, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in 12 days, the shape of a fight she might actually be able to win without throwing a single punch. Get me copies of both, she said. And Priya, don't tell anyone else you found this. Not yet. But somebody already suspected there was more to Joey Calhoun than a rancher who'd gotten lucky with a wrist lock. 2 days later, a woman from the Prairie County Gazette, not Cy Draymond's cousin, a different reporter entirely, one who'd been quietly collecting complaints about Draymond resorts for months, showed up at the ranch with an old military photograph she'd found doing a records search after Danny's story reached town. Staff Sergeant Josephine Calhoun, the reporter said, holding up a grainy printout. Combat medic, then military police K-9 handler, 2 tours, honorably discharged 4 years ago after an incident that's mostly redacted in the public record. She watched Joey's face carefully. You want to tell me what happened over there? Because whatever it was, I think it's the reason a bank chairman's son just found out the hard way not to put his hands on your ranch hand. Joey looked at the photograph for a long moment, herself at 26, thinner, harder around the eyes, standing beside a Belgian Malinois named Ranger who hadn't made it home from the incident the reporter was calling mostly redacted. She thought about her partner, Corporal Ellis Boyd, who had. I'll tell you what you can print, Joey said quietly. I served. I came home. I bought this ranch because I wanted a life where nothing depended on me being fast or dangerous ever again. Print that. Leave the rest where it is. The reporter nodded slowly, the way people do when they understand they've been handed a boundary and respect it more for how quietly it was drawn. But she wrote the story anyway. Joey Calhoun, decorated veteran, standing against a land baron trying to take her family's water rights through what one document expert was already calling irregularities requiring further investigation, and by Friday morning half the county had read it, and Cy Draymond's phone had not stopped ringing. Cy Draymond had built an empire out of quiet, patient pressure applied just outside the reach of a courtroom, and for 6 years it had worked because nobody had ever assembled the pieces fast enough to matter. Now the pieces were assembling themselves in a newspaper, in a title company's archive, in a county commission suddenly fielding calls from ranchers who'd stayed silent about their own surveying errors for fear of ending up like Earl. Draymond couldn't outlawyer a forged document once it was public. He could, however, still make an example of the woman who'd exposed it, and he chose the one stage guaranteed to put her in front of every rancher in the valley, the Labor Day livestock auction, held every year in the same fairground pens that had been selling cattle since 1948. Joey almost didn't go. She had every reason to stay home and let Priya's documents and the reporter's story do the rest of the work without her standing in the middle of it. But 6 of her cattle were already consigned to that auction, money she needed regardless of how the loan fight resolved, and Earl Whitlock asked her personally to come stand with him, because for the first time in 6 years he had neighbors willing to stand next to him too. The fairgrounds were crowded by 10 that morning, ranchers, buyers, families, a scattering of Draymond Resorts trucks parked conspicuously close to the auction ring, and Grady Draymond leaning against the rail with the specific loose confidence of a man who had decided, somewhere between Wednesday and Sunday, that a public rematch was the only way to erase what had happened at the equipment shed. Heard you've been telling people my father forges documents, he said, loud enough to draw heads, as Joey walked her cattle toward the holding pen. That's slander, Ms. Calhoun. Actionable. Might cost you more than the ranch. I haven't told anybody anything the county archive didn't already say, Joey answered, not stopping. You put a hand on me last week. Grady pushed off the rail and closed the distance, his voice dropping just enough that it read, to the gathering crowd, less like a threat and more like a man defending his honor. In front of witnesses. I've got half a mind to finish that conversation right here, see how tough you are without sucker punching a man from behind. I didn't sucker punch you. I stopped you from hitting a 17-year-old. Prove it. He was close now, close enough that Joey could see his father, Cy, watching from the shade of the announcer's booth with an expression that was working very hard to look like disapproval and failing to hide the small, satisfied curl at the corner of his mouth. Cy wanted this. Cy had sent his son to provoke exactly this, because a public brawl would let him paint her, in tomorrow's paper, as an unstable veteran with a temper, a story that could bury the forgery allegations under a more convenient one. Joey understood the trap the instant she saw it, and understood, in the same breath, that there was no longer any way around it. Walking away now meant Grady following her home. Calling the sheriff meant a 20-minute wait while Grady kept talking, kept escalating, kept performing for an audience that included every rancher whose water rights still hung in the balance. She had spent 4 years building a life specifically designed to never need what she was about to do again. Last chance, she said quietly. Walk away, Grady. He didn't. He grabbed her arm. Stage 1. She turned to break the grip the way she'd been trained, a short rotation, a step, weight dropping to take the joint out of his control, but Grady was heavier than his tailored confidence had any right to make him, and he was already moving forward with his own momentum, and instead of releasing clean he drove his shoulder into her chest and slammed her sideways into the steel pipe rail of the holding pen. Pain exploded along her ribs, a bright white line of it that stole the air out of her lungs. Her boot caught the bottom rail and she went down hard onto packed dirt, the impact jarring straight up through an old injury in her right shoulder that 4 years and a VA surgeon had never fully repaired, the same shoulder Ranger had been pulling against when the round came through the doorway in Kandahar province, the shoulder that had dislocated twice since and never quite forgiven her for either time. The crowd made a sound, a collective intake of breath, someone shouting her name, Earl already pushing forward before 2 other ranchers held him back. Grady stood over her, breathing hard, something ugly and triumphant flickering across his face, the look of a man who has just discovered that the story he wanted to tell about himself might actually be true. Stay down, he said. Stage 2. For 3 full seconds, she genuinely couldn't have gotten up if she'd tried. The dirt was cold under her palms. Her vision had gone bright and narrow at the edges, the particular tunnel of adrenaline and pain that she remembered from exactly one other place in her life, and for a fraction of a second the auction ring dissolved into a compound wall and dust and Ellis Boyd's voice going quiet on the radio, and her whole body wanted to do the thing it had been trained to do when the tunnel narrowed like that: freeze, assess, survive the next second and only the next second. She made herself breathe. In through the nose, for counts, the way the army had drilled into her long before any hand-to-hand instructor had. Her shoulder screamed when she rolled onto her good side. Her ribs screamed louder when she pushed herself up onto one knee. She was not the woman who had walked calmly across a paddock 5 days ago. She was hurt, and scared in a way she hadn't let herself be scared in years. And for one long moment as Grady closed the distance again she genuinely did not know if she could stop him. She got up anyway. Not because she wasn't afraid. Because Danny was somewhere in that crowd, and Earl was straining against 2 men's hands to reach her, and there was a girl of maybe 9 sitting on her father's shoulders at the rail with her hand pressed over her mouth. And none of them deserved to watch this end with Joey Calhoun face down in the dirt because she'd decided fear was a good enough reason to stay there. Stage 3. Grady swung a wide, looping right hand, the punch of a man who had never actually needed to finish a fight in his life because someone had always stopped it for him before the consequences arrived. Joey didn't try to match his strength, her shoulder wouldn't have allowed it even if she'd wanted to. She stepped inside the arc instead, close enough that the punch had no room to build force, and used her good arm to redirect his wrist past her, letting his own weight carry him half a step off balance. That was all the space she needed. Not power. Timing. She hooked her uninjured arm around behind his elbow, turned her hips, and used his forward momentum against the one thing he hadn't protected, his base. He went down hard onto the same packed dirt he'd put her into, and before he could get his hands under himself she dropped her knee across his shoulder blades, carefully, deliberately, weight distributed so it hurt without breaking anything, and pinned his right wrist flat against the small of his own back. He thrashed. She adjusted, patient the way she'd learned to be patient with a green horse, never fighting his strength directly, only ever redirecting it until it had nowhere left to go. Her ribs burned white-hot with every shift of her weight. She held the position anyway, because holding it was easier, and safer for everyone watching, than letting him back up. "Stop," she said, quiet enough that only he could hear it. "You put your hands on a kid. You put your hands on me. I am not interested in hurting you further. I am only interested in you staying on this ground until someone with a badge gets here." Stage 4. Sheriff Reyes had been at the fairgrounds since 9 that morning, working a livestock theft complaint 2 pens over, and he reached the ring 40 seconds after the first shout went up, fast enough to see Joey holding a restrained, red-faced Grady Draymond flat against the dirt with a control so precise it looked almost gentle, and to see Cy Draymond frozen at the rail with an expression that had finally, publicly, stopped pretending to be disapproval and started looking like fear. "Let him up, Joey," Reyes said, crouching beside them. "I've got him." She released the hold immediately, the way she always did, no hesitation, no lingering, no need to make Grady feel 1 second more of it than the situation required. She sat back on her heels in the dirt, cradling her injured arm against her ribs, and let Reyes cuff a man who was, for once, too shocked to say a single word in his own defense. They didn't arrest Grady for the fight. Wyoming law was generous toward self-defense against an unprovoked grab in front of 40 witnesses, and Reyes had seen enough of it himself to write the report that way without a moment's hesitation. They arrested him 3 hours later, after Priya Anand's documents reached the county attorney's desk alongside a sworn statement from a retired document examiner the Gazette reporter had tracked down in Cheyenne, who confirmed under his own name what Priya had suspected in the dark of the title company archive. The 2019 refiling of the Calhoun note was not a copy of the 2003 original. It was a fabrication, drafted to insert a balloon clause that had never existed, filed under Cy Draymond's direction by a loan officer who, once the county attorney sat him down without his employer in the room, was extremely willing to talk about how many other refiled notes he'd processed the same way over the previous 6 years. Earl Whitlock's 400 acres were the first case reopened. Then 2 smaller ranches south of the creek, then a 4th Joey hadn't even known about, a widow named Constance Ruiz, no relation to Danny, who'd sold her grazing rights for 1/3 of their worth in 2021 after being told, wrongly, that a state easement already claimed half of them. By the time the county attorney's office finished its review that fall, 6 separate landowners had grounds to challenge transactions going back years, and the State Banking Commission had opened its own inquiry into the branch Cy Draymond chaired. Cy himself was never charged with forging a signature. He'd been careful enough, in 6 years, to keep his own hands off the paperwork. But the commission he'd sat on for a decade asked for his resignation within a month, quietly, the way institutions do when they'd rather not admit in public how long they'd looked the other way. The county planning office reopened the environmental review for Draymond Resort's groundbreaking, the same review that had somehow cleared his water rights acquisitions without a single independent inspection, and the golf course that was supposed to break ground the following spring stalled indefinitely under the weight of 11 separate legal challenges. Grady's assault charge stuck, along with a second charge for the forged document he'd personally served at Joey's gate, which the county attorney successfully argued he'd known was fraudulent when he delivered it. He would not go to prison. A good lawyer and a clean record before that summer saw to a suspended sentence and 18 months of probation, but the Draymond name, which had opened every door in the county for 2 generations, closed a great many of them instead, and he left the state before Christmas. The county held a town hall in late September, ostensibly to discuss the stalled Draymond Resort's groundbreaking, and it turned into something closer to a confession booth. One rancher after another stood up at the folding table microphone to describe a surveying error, a recalculated balloon clause, a water rights buyout they'd been too afraid to question at the time, stories that had sat quiet in kitchens and truck cabs for years, waiting for someone else to go first. Earl went first. Then Constance Ruiz, her voice shaking but steady enough to get through it. Then two more names Joey didn't recognize, ranchers from the far side of the valley who'd sold out entirely rather than fight and had been too ashamed of the price to say so out loud until that night. She didn't speak. She sat in the back row next to Danny and Priya and let the room do what it needed to do without her standing at the front of it, because the story had never actually been about her. It had only needed someone willing to stop being quiet first, and once that happened it turned out half the county had been waiting for permission to do the same. The county inspector who'd waved off the brown water in Joey's South Trough turned in his resignation the same week. The Gazette ran a follow-up piece quoting 3 other ranchers who'd been too afraid to report similar visits until they saw Joey's name attached to a story that ended in Cy Draymond losing his commission seat. One of them was a man named Kurt Halvorsen, who had spent a year hating Joey Calhoun on principle. She'd outbid him on a hay contract in 2023 and he'd never quite let it go, and who showed up at her gate that October with a case of motor oil and an apology so awkward it made her laugh out loud for the first time in weeks. "Wasn't fair, what I thought about you," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Man who beats a spoiled rich kid in front of the whole county and then hands him over to the sheriff instead of finishing him, that's not the kind of person I figured you for. Figured you were trouble. Turns out you're just about the only one of us who wasn't scared enough to do something." She took the oil. She didn't take the compliment, not really, just nodded and told him the price on hay next season would be fair to everybody, including him, and watched something in his shoulders loosen that had been tight since long before he'd ever met her. Kurt wasn't the only one. By November, 3 more ranchers who'd quietly sold water rights to Draymond over the years had filed their own challenges with the county attorney's office. Emboldened, they each said in one form or another, by watching a woman half their size refuse to be the last person Cy Draymond ever intimidated. None of it made Joey feel like a hero. It mostly made her tired, and a little sad that it had taken a public fistfight in a livestock ring to give a whole valley permission to say out loud what they'd known privately for years. Danny's mother came by 2 weeks after the auction with a pie and an offer she'd clearly rehearsed the whole drive over. She wanted to pay Joey back, somehow, for what had happened to her son, though nobody could say exactly what somehow meant when the debt in question was a split eyebrow and a summer that had ended in the exposure of a 6-year fraud. Joey told her the only payment she'd accept was Danny finishing his diploma, which he did the following June, and which he celebrated by asking, very seriously, whether Calhoun Creek Ranch might need a full-time hire once he graduated instead of a summer one. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Priya Anand left the title company for a paralegal program at the State University that January, on a scholarship the Gazette reporter had quietly helped her apply for after writing a second story about the young woman who'd found the forgery no one else had thought to look for. She sent Joey a photograph of her acceptance letter with a single line underneath it, "Wouldn't have looked if you hadn't given me a reason to believe it mattered." Reyes never asked Joey the full story of what happened overseas, and she never volunteered it. But the next time her name came up at the department, in the context of a disturbance call 2 towns over where a woman fitting no description anyone could quite agree on had apparently talked a domestic dispute down to nothing before deputies even arrived, he found himself saying, without really planning to, that Josephine Calhoun was probably the most trustworthy person he'd ever met, with a reason not to trust anybody at all. Only Earl ever got the whole of it, and only because he asked in a way nobody else had, not out of curiosity, but because he'd spent 40 years farming ground that had nearly broken him twice, and he recognized in her the particular quiet of someone who had already survived the worst thing that was going to happen to them. They were mending fence along the shared line between their 2 properties in November. the same fence Grady's semi had once blocked her from clearing, and Earl asked without looking up from the wire stretcher, "You want to tell me about the dog in that photograph the Gazette printed, or you want me to keep guessing?" Joey drove the last staple in before she answered. His name was Ranger. Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, better at his job than I ever was at mine. We cleared buildings together, me and him and a corporal named Ellis Boyd, who'd been my partner for 2 years by the time it happened. She coiled the extra wire slowly, giving her hands something to do. There was a compound outside Kandahar. Intel was bad, said it was empty. It wasn't. Round came through a doorway before Ranger even alerted. Ellis pushed me clear and took it instead. Ranger went in after the shooter on his own, the way he was trained to, and didn't come back out. Earl didn't say anything for a long moment. He just kept working the wire, giving her the silence to fill or not fill as she chose. I dislocated the shoulder pulling Ellis's weight the last 30 yards to the extraction point, she said. He didn't make it. I got a medal I keep in a drawer and 4 years of a VA counselor telling me that surviving something isn't the same thing as deserving to. I believed her, eventually. Took a long time. She looked out at the ridge, at the 2 graves and the 6 horses and the ranch she'd nearly lost twice now, once to a bank, once, briefly, to a memory she couldn't outrun in a dirt ring on Labor Day. I bought this place because I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing something that only ever asked me to be gentle. Groom a horse. Teach a scared kid how to earn its trust. Never again be the reason somebody's counting on me for the thing I used to be good at. And then Draymond made you be it anyway, Earl said quietly. Once. For about 90 seconds, in front of the whole county. She managed something close to a smile. I'd rather it stay 90 seconds. Rest of my life, if I've got any say in it. Earl nodded slowly and went back to the fence, and neither of them spoke of it again, which was, Joey understood, its own kind of gift, being trusted with the truth and then simply allowed to go back to work. The first hard frost came in early December, the kind that silvered the fence wire and sent breath curling up over the horses' backs in the paddock. Joey was up before dawn the way she always was, boots crunching over stiff grass on her way to the barn, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a bucket of grain in the other. Copper met her at the gate first, the way he always did, nosing at her coat pocket for the peppermint he'd learned to expect. Her shoulder still ached in weather like this. The surgeon in Cheyenne had told her it probably always would, some old injuries just settling into a body the way a house settles into its foundation, and she'd stopped minding the ache the way she used to. It reminded her of things worth remembering. Danny showed up at 7, breath fogging, work gloves already on, asking without preamble whether they were still planning to break the young filly to a lead line before the ground froze solid. Joey said they were. He grinned and went to fetch the halter, and she watched him go with the particular satisfaction of someone who has, against long odds, ended up exactly where she was supposed to be. The loan was gone, dismissed with prejudice, the county attorney's letter had said, along with a formal notice that Calhoun Creek Ranch's original 2003 note, balloon clause, and all, was void as a matter of law. The bank that inherited what was left of Cy Draymond's branch had sent, of all things, an apology, along with a modest settlement that had gone straight into a new well pump and 6 months of hay Joey no longer had to ration. She fed the horses. She checked the water trough, running clear now, no brown sediment, no county inspector who owed anybody a favor. She walked the fence line her grandfather had built in 1961 and found, as she always did, that it was still standing, still sound, still exactly where he'd left it. Then she poured a second cup of coffee, sat on the porch step with the sun coming up gold over the ridge where her mother and grandfather were buried, and let the quiet settle over her the way it did every morning now, not the quiet of a woman hiding from what she used to be, but the quiet of a woman who had finally stopped needing to. Somewhere behind her, Danny was laughing at something the filly had done. Somewhere down the valley, a truck she didn't recognize slowed at Earl's gate and a woman got out to shake his hand, another rancher, she'd learn later, whose water rights case had just been reopened because of a young paralegal who'd once decided a forgotten archive was worth staying late for. Joey Calhoun drank her coffee, watched the light come up over Calhoun Creek, and went back to work.